Political factions are tearing civilization apart, and nobody's asking why this keeps happening. The Gnostics knew. In texts buried for 15 centuries, they described the Archons as forces that maintain control over humanity through one primary mechanism: division. Not physical chains, not direct oppression, but getting human beings to destroy each other while the actual prison remains unexamined. Every election cycle, you're told this is the most important moment in history. Every political crisis escalates the rhetoric. Your family stops speaking over who they voted for. Strangers on the internet become mortal enemies over policy positions neither of them fully understands, and it never stops. There's always another election, another crisis, another reason you need to fight harder, donate more, argue louder, hate deeper. The Apocryphon of John describes how Archons created the material world as a prison and maintain it through ignorance and distraction. Humanity possesses divine consciousness, a fragment of the true God trapped in matter, but the Archons need you to never realize this, so they engineer conflict. Horizontal conflict between humans instead of vertical awakening to what you actually are. Look at the pattern. Political movements promise transcendence. They promise the perfected society, the restoration of golden ages, the defeat of evil, the triumph of good. These are spiritual promises dressed in material terms. The left promises liberation from oppression and the birth of true equality. The right promises return to natural order and the preservation of sacred tradition. Both sides are accessing real human longings for meaning and purpose, but channeling them into endless warfare that resolves nothing, because it's not supposed to resolve anything. The Gnostics called this Hymarmene, cosmic fate, the sense that you're trapped in forces beyond control and must constantly struggle or everything collapses. Every political faction operates from this framework. If we don't win, catastrophe follows. If we don't stop them, civilization ends. This emergency state becomes permanent. You never get to step back because the threat never ends, it just changes form. And while you're completely absorbed in this struggle, while every ounce of your attention and emotional energy pours into political combat, you're not asking deeper questions. What is consciousness? Why does subjective experience exist? What are you beyond this body and these social identities? Those questions are dangerous because they lead to gnosis, direct knowledge of reality that transcends the material prison. The Archons can't allow that, so they need you distracted. And political faction fighting is perfect because it hijacks your genuine desire for a better world and traps it in cycles that never threaten the deeper structure. Think about how political discourse actually functions now. It's not about convincing anyone. It's not about finding truth or solving problems. It's tribal warfare. You don't engage with opposing arguments, you attack character and motive. You don't build coalitions, you enforce purity within your tribe. You don't collaborate, you crush enemies. Both sides do this. Everyone thinks they're the resistance while feeding the exact system that keeps them enslaved. The hypostasis of the Archons describes how these entities work through deception and imitation, creating false versions of divine reality. Political ideologies are exactly this. They mimic spiritual awakening. They offer community, purpose, meaning, a narrative where you're the hero fighting darkness. But it's all directed toward material outcomes in a domain specifically designed to prevent genuine transcendence. You're trying to find salvation in the realm that exists to ensure you never find it. And the emotional charge is the giveaway. Notice how political content makes you feel. That surge of righteous anger. That fear when you see what the other side is doing. That contempt for people who don't understand what you understand. These aren't accidents. The Gnostics taught that Archons feed on these exact emotional states, lower vibrational consciousness. When you're consumed with hatred for political enemies, you're generating exactly the energy these forces need to sustain themselves. You think you're fighting for justice, but you're maintaining your own prison. Now look at how the divisions multiply. It's not just two sides anymore. Within each political faction, there are endless subdivisions. Progressive splits from liberal, splits from leftist, splits from democratic socialist, splits from anarchist. Conservative splits from libertarian, splits from traditionalist, splits from nationalist. Each subdivision creates new conflicts, new purity tests, new reasons to fight people who mostly agree with you. The fragmentation is infinite because the point isn't ideological coherence. It's maximum conflict generating maximum distraction, generating maximum energy for the archontic system. You're told these fights matter because real policies affect real lives, and that's true. People suffer under bad governments. Rights get restricted, economies collapse. Wars kill millions. But notice how the fighting about these issues never actually resolves them. The same debates repeat across generations. The same problems persist under different administrations. The temperature keeps rising, but nothing fundamentally changes because the fighting is the point, not the solution. The secret book of John describes counterfeit spirits that mimic authentic spiritual impulses, but bind them to material attachments. Your political identity does exactly this. It gives you meaning, purpose, community, righteousness, but it's entirely constructed from material categories. It keeps your consciousness locked in the prison while making you feel like you're doing something important. You think you're awake because you see through the lies of the other side, but you're still completely asleep to the larger structure. Both sides are. That's what makes it so effective. The right thinks the left is destroying civilization with degeneracy and chaos. The left thinks the right is destroying civilization with oppression and hierarchy. Both are convinced the other side is evil, subhuman even, and must be stopped at all costs. Meanwhile, the actual forces maintaining the prison don't care which faction wins any particular battle because the war itself is what they need. Every hour you spend consuming political content, every argument with family, every friendship destroyed over voting patterns, every moment of hatred toward people you've never met because of their political affiliation. You're doing the Archons' work. You're maintaining the system of division that keeps humanity from awakening to its divine nature. And the genius is that you can't just opt out by being apolitical or centrist, because those become their own tribal identities that other people attack, pulling you back into the conflict. The machine is designed to be inescapable through normal means. The Gnostics said the only way out is gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of your true nature that transcends all material categories, including political ones. But that requires withdrawing energy from the horizontal battles long enough to look up, and the system is specifically engineered to make that almost impossible. There's always another outrage, another emergency, another reason you can't possibly step back right now. Maybe after this election, maybe after this crisis passes. But it never passes because it's not supposed to. The texts found at Nag Hammadi weren't just philosophical speculation. The people who wrote them and were hunted down and erased from history had experienced something that terrified the powers that eventually became Orthodox Christianity. They had gnosis, direct perception of reality that revealed the material world as a trap, and political religious authority as part of the control mechanism. That's why they were destroyed so thoroughly, not because their ideas were wrong, but because they were dangerous to the system. The early church fathers wrote screeds against the Gnostics, calling them heretics and madmen, but read what they were actually teaching. They said the God of the material world, the creator deity, was not the true God, but a lesser entity called the demiurge. This false god created the physical realm as a prison and installed archons as wardens. Human consciousness contains a divine spark from beyond this prison, but the entire structure of material reality exists to keep you from remembering that. And one of the primary control mechanisms is getting humans to identify completely with temporary material categories. Your nation, your political party, your race, your class, your ideology. These become who you think you are, and once you're fully identified with them, you'll fight to the death to defend them. You'll pour all your energy into conflicts with other humans who identify with different material categories. And while you're doing that, you're not remembering what you actually are, which is divine consciousness temporarily trapped in matter. Now watch how political factions operate, and you'll see this pattern everywhere. Each side develops elaborate mythologies about their origins and destiny. America as the last hope for freedom, or America as the source of global oppression. The working class as revolutionary vanguard, or the working class as guardians of traditional values. Western civilization as the pinnacle of human achievement, or Western civilization as genocidal colonialism. These aren't just policy disagreements. These are competing religious narratives, and people commit to them with religious fervor. They'll sacrifice relationships, money, time, mental health, everything to serve these narratives, but the narratives are constructs. They are ways of organizing material reality that feel true and important, but ultimately keep you locked in the prison because you are still operating entirely within material categories. The Gnostics would say you're worshiping the demiurge, the false god of matter, whether you realize it or not. Whenever you treat any material outcome as ultimate, as the thing that really matters, you're reinforcing the prison. And political factions are entirely about material outcomes. Win this election, pass this law, stop that policy, defeat those people. It's all horizontal, all material, all within the prison. There's this concept in Gnostic texts called the veil of forgetfulness. When divine consciousness descends into the material realm, it forgets its true nature. The Archons maintain this forgetting through various means, and one of the most effective is keeping you completely absorbed in material concerns and conflicts. Think about how much of your consciousness is occupied by political content. You wake up and check the news. You see what fresh horror the other side has committed. You feel that spike of adrenaline and anger. You maybe argue about it online or with family. You consume analysis and commentary. You feel anxious about upcoming elections or policies. You imagine scenarios where your side loses and everything falls apart. This cycles through your mind constantly, and while it's happening, you're not present, you're not examining your own consciousness, you're not asking fundamental questions about the nature of reality. You're trapped in a reactive loop, which is exactly where the Archons need you. The Pistis Sophia, another Gnostic text, describes how the soul gets trapped in matter through attachment, and how liberation requires recognizing these attachments as illusions. Your political identity is one of these attachments. It feels incredibly real and important. The threat from the other side feels genuine. The stakes feel ultimate. But that's because you're identified with a material category that's temporary and constructed. In 100 years, none of the current political factions will exist in their present form. The issues that seem so critical now will be forgotten or transformed into something unrecognizable. The people you hate and the people you love will all be dead. But consciousness continues, and if the Gnostics are right, it continues in cycles of imprisonment until it achieves gnosis and escapes. Every life you spend completely absorbed in material conflicts is another life where you don't escape. Now, this doesn't mean political issues don't matter in the relative sense. If you're suffering under an oppressive government, that suffering is real. If your rights are being stripped away, that violation is real. If war is destroying your community, that horror is real. The Gnostics weren't saying to ignore material reality. They were saying to see it clearly for what it is. A prison where suffering is inevitable because the structure is designed to create suffering. And the way the Archons keep you from escaping is by convincing you that the right arrangement of material circumstances will finally end the suffering. Just win this political battle. Just establish this system. Just defeat these enemies. Then everything will be okay. But it's never okay because you're trying to fix a prison by rearranging the furniture. The structure itself is the problem. Look at how much political activism is driven by trauma and fear. People who experienced oppression or violence or loss become politically engaged to prevent others from experiencing the same thing. That impulse is beautiful and human, but watch what happens to it. It gets channeled into factional warfare. It becomes fuel for hatred of the other side. It becomes justification for escalating rhetoric and dehumanization. The original wound doesn't heal. It just expands and creates more wounds. The trauma becomes collective and transgenerational. Your political faction carries the trauma of past injustices and uses it to justify present aggression, which creates future trauma for other factions, which they use to justify their own aggression. It is an infinite cycle, and nobody ever actually heals because healing would require stepping outside the framework of material conflict, but the Archontic system is specifically designed to prevent that. The Gospel of Philip, another Nag Hammadi text, talks about how the world feeds on corpses and everything you consume in the material realm is dead. Political factions feed on dead ideas, dead conflicts, historical grievances from decades or centuries ago that get reanimated and weaponized. You're not actually fighting present battles, you're replaying ancient patterns of conquest and resistance, oppressor and oppressed, order and chaos. These archetypal conflicts are hardwired into the structure of material reality, and the Archons ensure that humans keep acting them out generation after generation because each iteration generates the fear, and anger and division that sustains the prison. Think about how political discourse uses history. Every faction has its sacred victims and its designated villains. These historical narratives are treated as immutable truth that justifies present action. But history is always interpretation. The same events can be narrated completely differently depending on your framework. The founding of America is either liberation from tyranny or the beginning of genocide. The French Revolution is either the birth of democracy or the descent into mob violence. Every historical moment is contested, but within political factions, one version becomes gospel and questioning it becomes heresy. Why? Because the point isn't historical truth, it's tribal cohesion. Shared narratives bind the group together and distinguish it from other groups. And once you're bound to the narrative, once your identity is wrapped up in this particular interpretation of history, you'll fight anyone who challenges it. You're defending yourself, or so it feels, but really you're defending a construct that keeps you imprisoned. The Archons don't care what political narratives you believe, as long as you believe them absolutely and define yourself against people who believe different ones. Here's what nobody wants to hear. Awakening means letting go of your political identity, and that feels like death because you've built your entire sense of self around it. Who are you if you're not fighting for justice or defending tradition or resisting tyranny? Who are you if you're not on the right side of history? The Gnostic answer is that your divine consciousness temporarily experiencing material existence, and all these identities are costumes you're wearing in a play you've forgotten is a play. But the Archons need you to believe the play is reality, so they make the stakes feel ultimate. They make your political enemies seem like existential threats. They make every election into Armageddon. And it works because on some level, you know something is deeply wrong with the world. You know you're trapped in something. You know there's suffering everywhere, and it shouldn't be this way. That knowledge is actually a memory of your divine origin, but the Archontic system redirects it into material political action that never addresses the root cause. You're told the reason everything's wrong is because of those people over there. The fascists or the communists or the elites or the immigrants or the patriots or the globalists. If you could just defeat them, if you could just implement the right policies, if you could just win enough elections, then the world would be fixed. But the world has never been fixed by political action because political action operates within the material prison, and the prison is functioning exactly as designed. The suffering isn't a bug, it's a feature. The conflict isn't a problem to solve, it's the mechanism of control. Look at how totalizing political identity has become. People choose where to live based on politics. They only befriend people with the right political views. They consume only media that confirms their political narrative. They view every aspect of life through a political lens. Art, food, music, sports, entertainment, everything gets categorized as aligned with your faction or aligned with the enemy. This is complete psychological absorption into the material prison. There's no space left for anything transcendent, anything that might point beyond the political, anything that might suggest there's a more fundamental reality than factional conflict. And if you try to step outside, both sides attack you. If you say maybe the real problem isn't left versus right, but the entire structure of material reality as a trap for consciousness, the left calls you a privileged escapist ignoring real oppression, and the right calls you a dangerous mystic undermining traditional values. You get pushed back into the conflict from both directions because the system needs everyone inside it. The Gnostic texts talk about the counterfeit spirit, the false self that the Archons install in humans to keep them identified with material existence. Your political identity is a perfect example. It feels like authentically you, like your deepest values and convictions, but it's actually a construct installed by the culture you were born into. If you'd been born in a different time or place, you'd have completely different political views. The conservative in modern America would have been a revolutionary in feudal Europe. The progressive in contemporary society would have been a traditionalist in a tribal culture. The content of political belief is relative to context, but the structure is the same. Identify with a material category. Define yourself against others. Pour your energy into defending your category and attacking theirs. This structure is what the Archons need, and they don't care what specific political content fills it. Now, here's the difficult part. You can't just think your way out of this. Intellectual understanding that political factions are archontic distraction doesn't liberate you. The Gnostics were very clear about this. Gnosis isn't intellectual knowledge, it's direct experiential realization of your divine nature. It's not something you figure out, it's something that happens to you, and it fundamentally transforms how you experience reality. But it can't happen while you're completely absorbed in material conflicts, because those conflicts keep your consciousness locked in the lower vibrational states where the Archons operate. You need to withdraw energy from the horizontal battles. Not forever, not completely, but enough to create space for vertical awakening. And the system fights this viciously. The moment you start to pull back, the moment you start to question whether political faction fighting is really the most important thing, you feel guilty. You're abandoning the cause. You're letting the other side win. You're being complicit in oppression or the destruction of civilization. This guilt is installed by the archontic system to keep you trapped. Because if enough humans withdrew their energy from factional conflict, if enough people started asking the deeper questions, the prison would start to collapse. The Archons would lose their food source. The entire structure depends on keeping humanity divided and distracted. And political factions are the most effective mechanism ever devised for doing exactly that. Think about what political engagement actually produces in your consciousness. Anger, fear, contempt, anxiety, hatred, tribal superiority, self-righteousness. These are low vibrational states. These are states of contraction and separation. The Gnostics would say these are states where archontic influence is strongest. Now think about what awakening requires. Expansion, unity, transcendence of material categories, direct perception of consciousness as fundamental reality. These are incompatible with being absorbed in political faction fighting. You can't simultaneously hate half of humanity for their political views and experience the unity of all consciousness. You can't simultaneously be terrified that the other side is destroying everything. and rest in the peace of knowing your true nature is beyond material destruction. The political and the spiritual point in opposite directions, and the Archons have successfully convinced most people that the political is the only direction that matters. You're told that spirituality is escapism, that focusing on consciousness is selfish, that the real work is material political struggle. But that's the voice of the prison trying to keep you imprisoned. The real work, the only work that actually threatens the archontic system, is awakening to your divine nature and liberating your consciousness from identification with material categories, including political ones. This doesn't mean you become passive or indifferent to suffering. The Gnostics weren't advocating for quietism, but your actions come from a completely different place. Instead of reactive hatred and fear-driven tribal warfare, you act from compassion and clarity. You see other humans, including political opponents, as divine consciousness trapped in the same prison you're escaping. You don't need to defeat them, you need to help them wake up. But they can't wake up while you're confirming their belief that you're the enemy, that the battle is real, that material political victory is what matters. Every time you engage in political faction fighting, you're reinforcing the prison for everyone involved. The Archons win regardless of which faction wins any particular battle, because the battle itself is what they need. The only way to stop feeding them is to stop fighting and start awakening. And that's the last thing the system allows you to consider.